So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today for the Orkney Energy Revolution session. We've got 4 speakers for you today. So we've got Liam Branagh from Solo Energy, Gareth Davis from Aquaterra, Richie Ainsworth from EMEC, and Adele Lidderdale from Orkney Islands Council. Now, just while we're waiting for some more people to log in, we're going to start off with a poll. So we would like to ask just where people are joining from to get a view of the global reach of this session. So the poll should be up on your screen just now. If you could fill that in and submit that, please. We'll just give 30 seconds to a minute to get the responses in, and then we can share that with all the participants. So while we're waiting for the poll responses to come through, oh, is that host is sharing the poll? Was that so? Majority is from Europe, probably not surprising given the time of day, quite early over in the United States at the moment. Yeah, so good to see that there is some variation in terms of the various people that are phoning in today. So thank you for joining us. I think we'll just get started. So putting the slides up. Again, welcome. So for those of you that have just joined, welcome to the session on Orkney's Energy Revolution, looking at how Orkney is leading the way to a low carbon future. If you did miss the introductions before, we've got Gareth Davis, who is the Managing Director at Aquaterra, Liam Branagh, who is the Technology Director at Solo Energy, Richie Ainsworth, who is our Hydrogen Project Manager here at the European Marine Energy Centre, also known as EMEC, and Adele Lidderdale, who is the Hydrogen Project Officer at Orkney Islands Council. And just to introduce myself, I'm Lisa McKenzie. I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager at EMEC as well. So what we're going to go through today is give you an overview of where we've come from, the sort of history behind Orkney's energy revolution and the activity that has been taking place here in Orkney to date. And Gareth will talk us through that. Then we'll move over to Liam, who is going to introduce a really exciting new project that we launched about 6 months ago called ReFLEX Orkney, and is looking how to integrate electricity, transport and heat networks across Orkney. We'll then move over to Richie and Adele, who are going to do a bit of a tag team on introducing some of the really exciting projects and initiatives that are happening here in Orkney regarding green hydrogen. And then finishing off the session today, Gareth will cover kind of looking to the future and looking at further sustainable development across Orkney, but also looking at how what's happened here in Orkney can be replicated throughout the globe. So just passing on over to Gareth. Just while Gareth's getting set up, really like to encourage everyone to submit questions into the Q&A function if you can, and at the end of each presentation we'll cover some of the questions at that point then. So Gareth, over to you.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody to the Orkney Islands. So we're positioned off the north of the British Isles and close to the Shetland Islands, which lie to the north, and to Caithness and Sutherland, which lie to the south. So what we wanted to do was share with you some of the history about how Orkney has delivered this opportunity to lead the world in renewable energy. And this is underpinned Okay.
Yeah, you can scroll it if you want.
So this has been underpinned largely by the resources that we have here. The islands are buffeted by waves and wind. We have tides flowing through between the islands, and we've also got abundant oil resources lying offshore from Orkney. In recent years, we've adopted hydrogen as a fuel mode, which you'll hear about later. And although you may not think so at this latitude, we do have some solar resources and also some thermal resources that we exploit as well. So over the last decades, Orkney has been through a number of stages in its energy development. We started off in the 1970s, where the islands were chosen as a base for an oil terminal. In the 80s, we embraced wind and had the world's largest wind turbine in the islands, a 3-megawatt machine, through the 80s and 90s. Into the 90s, we really looked then at marine energy, and that continued into the 2000s. Energy efficiency has been a big part of what we've been looking at. And over the last decade, hydrogen and energy storage has become an important part of the mix. Looking forward, we're now looking towards an integrated energy solution that helps us decarbonize our whole energy system. And we're going to be talking about that today. This has happened through a number of things, and it's involved the commitment of people, about money. About £1 billion worth have been spent in Orkney across the whole energy spectrum. It's about having the right sites for development, and it's also about having the right ideas to meet the energy demand that we have. And alongside these material things, we've also developed knowledge and expertise, which we've then been very happy to share with other parts of the world. And this is part of what we're doing today, obviously. So let's look first at electrical demand. And Orkney is incredibly proud of the fact that we've already got to the point where 100% of our electricity is provided by renewable energy. And you can see here on the graph over the last 10 years or so, how that capacity has ramped up, mainly from large-scale onshore wind. And this means that in most months and most weeks, we're exporting energy to the Scottish mainland rather than importing electricity from Scotland. But this journey has not just been about big-scale wind, it's also involved small-scale wind. Over the last 10 years, we've had 740 micro wind turbines installed across the islands. And this is mainly on the basis of a feed-in tariff regime which existed in the early part of the last decade. And not only has this given us renewable energy to households and farms, it's also given us income into the community as well. As well as generating energy, we also use energy in imaginative ways, and in the adoption of electric vehicles is one example. We now have over 220 vehicles in the county. We also have buses and other infrastructure associated with that. And this influx of electric vehicles has allowed us to gather data from that community to see how they're used and to think about how we could further decarbonise vehicle transport in the future. Again, we'll come back to that when we talk about ReFLEX. Some interesting statistics there is that a vehicle in Orkney on average travels about 24 miles a day, and the average speed is around 30 miles per hour when the cars are in use, which takes about 1 hour per day. Another feature of Orkney's renewable energy journey has been around marine energy. And here you can see the multitude of marine technologies that have been deployed at the EMEC test centre over the last 15 years or so. And around this technology boom has been the development and the support of the supply chain locally, which has worked with EMEC to provide the services and resources needed to put these machines and keep them in the water. So within any community, there's an important question about who benefits from these initiatives. And from the outset, Orkney has been very keen to make sure that as many people as possible benefit from the renewable energy revolution that's going on. What you can see here are some of the numbers that indicate how people are involved. Some people might have jobs, some people might be hosts to technology, others might be investors in schemes. But overall, we think that around 3,000 of our 10,000 households have a direct link and benefit from renewables, and that's about 25 to 30% of those households. So what relevance is this experience in Orkney to the UK system? So here we've got a graph which shows in grey the UK demand and in green, the UK renewable energy production in August of this year. And so this is essentially where we are today in the UK. But as renewables grows in penetration, that green line is going to increase. And if we look to the future with perhaps 4 times the renewables capacity installed, you can see that it becomes a very noisy picture with peaks and troughs that maybe don't correlate with the demand peaks and troughs that occur. So if this is what tomorrow might look like in the UK, interestingly, interestingly, that tomorrow for the UK is exactly what Orkney looks like now. Because we have 100% of our electricity coming from renewable energy, you can see here that when the wind blows strongly, we generate a tremendous amount of energy. And then when that goes away, we need to have solutions that allow for those demand to be met in the periods of less generation. So effectively, we're a living laboratory in Orkney for what the future energy system might look like. And the transition that we've gone on over the last 10 years can be seen at the bottom. Now, if you look at this graph, which shows on any particular day whether we've imported energy in red or exported electricity in green. And what you can see is that over the 10 years, we've moved from an import-dominated situation to an export-dominated situation. So effectively, what we've talked about there is the decarbonisation of electricity. But this Sankey diagram shows in proportion our whole energy stack. And what you can see is that electricity is only about 15 to 20% of our total energy demand. So our huge challenge now is to decarbonize the rest of this stack through further electrification, through the adoption of hydrogen and synthetic fuels and other solutions. So what we're going to be talking about for a lot of this presentation is how we're going about decarbonizing these other aspects of our energy system. And underpinning that is also the timeline, the target of when we're going to achieve that. So in the UK recently, we've had the government announce that they want to have a carbon neutral situation by 2050. In Scotland, the government has suggested that they want to be carbon neutral by 2045. But the challenge for all of these targets is that somewhere needs to go first. We need a community that can adopt decarbonisation and then show others how to do that. And so Orkney is setting itself up to achieve this target of carbon neutral by 2030. And that's an important stepping stone then for other communities to follow. And this isn't just electricity, this is the whole energy system. So underpinning this drive is a project called ReFLEX. And this ReFLEX project aims to use digital capacity to link the renewable generation to flexible demand. And by increasing the flexibility in demand, it allows the peaks and troughs to be evened out and for variable renewable energy to meet and match that demand. And what we're going to be doing is replicating that system across different communities in an integrated way across electricity, transport and heat. So within Orkney, we have long had constrained energy generation because of the weakness of our grid system. And so these localized power balancing mechanisms will help us control that. At the heart of it is a virtual power plant, which Liam's going to speak to next. And another important part of this system is that the technology is going to be pre-financed so that the customer can rent or lease technology rather than having to buy technology. And the team involved in that includes a number of the businesses that are here today, organizations that are here today. So we've got EMEC, Solo, Aquaterra, and Orkney Islands Council, but also Community Energy Scotland, Heriot-Watt University, and Doosan, the Korean engineering company. And these organizations are then supported by others and associated partners helping make the ReFLEX team. So the key enabling technologies that we're going to deliver are the virtual power plant. Again, Liam will speak a bit more about this with the smart metering and monitoring. We're also going to be looking at domestic, business and large scale batteries. We're going to be looking to lease and provide for rental electric vehicles. We're going to have smart charging systems associated with that, flexible state-of-the-art heating systems, and industrial scale hydrogen fuel cells and engines. So I'll pass on to Liam to explain a bit more about the details.
So just before we move on to Liam's talk, there's some questions that have come through, so we'll be addressing them just now, and we'll also launch our second poll, which is looking at what sectors all the participants are coming from, so that should be up on your screen now. Gareth, I'll just direct the first questions to you if that's okay. So thanks to Jerry Butler from the Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum in the Bahamas, up very early today, and thanks for your questions. He's wondering, is Orkney subject to storms and cyclones every year like they are in the Caribbean?
So there are slightly different types of storms. Interestingly, yesterday we had a kind of mild storm event where we had 50 or 60 mile an hour winds. So we do get subject to strong winds. Our record wind speed is about 115 miles an hour, which would probably be about 150 kilometers an hour. And so that's our highest level of wind speed. We quite often get wind speeds in the 70 to 80 miles an hour, which would be about 120 to 130 kilometers an hour. We might get 5 or 6 of those storm events each year. So we do get those, but they're not quite as severe as you get in hurricane areas.
And the next question from Jerry as well, which is maybe going to link into your presentation at the end of this, Gareth, but what are the key elements of Orkney's climate change commitments?
Our climate change commitments. So I guess the first thing is that we see an opportunity to use our resources for local energy production. And as you can see, we've gone on a journey in the last 20 years to decarbonise electricity. But our key commitment is not to stop at electricity. We realise that we actually still have a very high CO2 output per capita. And that's not just because of how we live in our houses. We live in a relatively cold and windy climate, but it's also because we have ferries going between all our islands, which give rise to a lot of our energy demand. We have air links between the islands and from Orkney to the mainland, which also create an energy demand as well. So what we're trying to do is holistically across the piece look at decarbonising those activities. The other interesting thing is, as an island community with quite a global reach, we have to think about international travel as well. And so things like this Virtual Island Summit, which is embracing essentially carbon-free communication, is something that's really interesting to us as well.
And a last question from Jerry here was asking whether the energy sector in Orkney is subsidised by mainland UK or Scotland.
So there are subsidies in the UK system, but the Orkney energy system is not subsidised preferentially to other areas of the UK. And in fact, in many respects, we're penalised compared to other areas. And the reason that comes about is that a lot of the rules and standards that are put in place are for average UK conditions. And because Orkney is anything but average in terms of the environmental conditions, we often suffer financially because of rules and standards that are put in place for other parts of the country. So we don't have any special assistance because we're Orkney, but we fight like everybody else for the assistance that we can get from government.
And a final question before we move on to Liam's presentation. So this one's in from Sophie Morgan. She's asking, can you explain a bit about the partnership between private power producers and the public utility power producers and how they find the balance to share the market while making a profit?
Okay, so our utility in Orkney is called Scottish and Southern Energy, and it's a kind of privatised body that was initially set up as a public utility. So when that utility was privatized in the 70s, it maintained all aspects of its business. So as well as being a transmission network operator, it's also a distribution network operator. It also has generation assets. It also sells energy to customers. And it actually also had a shop window for things like washing machines and cookers as well. So it basically privatized to cover all aspects of our energy supply. What then happened is when renewables became an option, people started putting up wind turbines and other forms of generation, and SSE were duty bound to allow them grid connections if those organizations applied for the grid. SSE themselves also developed a number of renewable energy projects. So there's been what you might call healthy competition between the incumbent utility and private developers. As the system became fuller, as we had more generation, SSE actually put a moratorium on any further development of private activity. And a lot of what you're going to hear about in terms of energy storage and balancing is really been our response as a community to that limitation on our system. So I think it's fair to say that it's not necessarily been a wholly mutually beneficial and collaborative relationship between the community and the utility, but we have, as a community, been able to find ways around it eventually so that we can still achieve the decarbonisation objectives that we have.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Gareth. So James just advised me there that Sophie, who posed that question, is from the Ministry of Energy and Environment in Seychelles. So thank you very much for putting that question into us. Now over to Liam Branagh from Solo Energy, who will give you a bit more insight into the ReFLEX Orkney project.
So hello everyone, and thanks to Gareth for setting the scene so well. I'll dive straight into my presentation. As Gareth mentioned, there's particularly high levels of renewables in the system in Orkney, exceeding 100%. And as we move forward in terms of the wider energy system, nationally and internationally, we're moving from percentage of renewables, maybe 20 to 30%, towards that shared vision of 100%. To realize that vision and to get there, we certainly believe that storage and flexibility need to be part of the solution. And what we're doing in the ReFLEX project is addressing that flexibility and storage element across three vectors of the energy system. So that's power, transport, and heat. So the ReFLEX customer offer, they offer to the end consumer, whether they be residential or commercial premises or business, incorporates a power element in terms of 100% renewable local energy supply, a low-cost EV leasing model to address the transport network, and renewable heating retrofits to address the heat side of things. So our integrated energy system, as a result, incorporates a lot of different technology, most of them shown on this slide here. So for example, in the heating element, we've domestic thermal storage, heat pumps technology. On the power side, we're incorporating residential, industrial, and commercial batteries. On transport, we're addressing the EV angle. So there's quite a high penetration of EVs in Orkney, as that's already been mentioned. And we also looking at things like hydrogen ferries and cold ironing, for example. And where do Solo as a company come into this? So our model is effectively to offer customers batteries, EV chargers, and other flexibility assets installed in their homes for free at no upfront cost to them. We control those assets to optimize their behavior and deliver benefits to the end consumer, to the grid, to the system operators of the grid, and to also energy suppliers. And we do that by operating those systems as a virtual power plant. So effectively, we take a large number of small distributed assets and operate them together to mimic what a traditional power plant would have done. And that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of how we operate. The reason being why we do this is to facilitate greater use of local renewable generation, is to help balance supply and demand on the grid, and it's obviously to deliver benefits as well to savings, in terms of savings to the end consumer. So as I mentioned, we partner with energy suppliers to offer that 100% renewable supply, and we recover the cost of the assets that we financed through revenue stacking. So we access various different markets, such as balancing services to system operators, such as reducing peak charges for consumers. So this is what our USP is. It's our FlexiGrid platform. Essentially, it's a cloud-based platform that controls multiple assets across the grid. So it brings back data from each site, and that data can be from an electric vehicle charger, for example, a residential battery, a commercial battery, or a heat pump. Brings it up into the cloud. We undertake some data analytics. We take in various different signals, whether they be from system operators or even weather forecasts, for example, and we determine how to optimally operate that asset. And then we push out control signals to each of those sites. And the control signals can be as simple as, for example, charge a battery now, or stop charging your EV. But the key point is that there's a great degree of optionality in having so many assets and of different types within the virtual power plant. Here we're showing a typical day. It's in terms of demand and wholesale market price on the UK grid. This is from a number of years ago now, but this is a pattern that repeats on a daily basis. You'll see earlier in the day there's a small peak. So at nighttime the demand is low across the network. That picks up in the early morning. There's a lull generally in the afternoon, followed by a much higher peak in the late evening as people arrive home and increased electricity usage. The wholesale electricity price tends to follow that pattern, so it's generally low during nighttime when demand is low, and then we see a nice spike in the evening. That spike is generally driven by the fact that balancing costs are higher, but also you're bringing on more and more generation, and that generation you're bringing on tends to be of reduced efficiency, so it's costlier to run. This traditionally, because demand couldn't be controlled, this has been a very one-way system. Price follows demand, but having the flexibility assets rolled across the grid and control of those flexibility assets means there's an opportunity here. For example, let's say you charge a large number of batteries, and off-peak times, you can potentially reduce demand on the system during those peak times. We're also seeing some very interesting developments in recent years in the UK, but also in wider European markets, that we're seeing negative wholesale prices. So this generally occurs when you've a lot of generation, renewable generation on the system. So for example, it's a particularly windy day and you have a lot of wind on the system. And why you might see a negative price is that it's actually costlier for a lot of the traditional generation plants to actually switch off. So they'll actually pay to stay on the grid, pay a certain figure to stay on connected to the grid and producing, so they don't have to switch off the generation and come back on. And that absolutely presents a significant opportunity if you're controlling EV charging, or electric vehicle charging, I should say, or controlling batteries, for example, and other heating elements. Wind and solar plays a significant role, obviously, in the variability of the system, but not even so much the actual total amount, but also forecast versus actual. So there's inherent uncertainty as we go to a greater degree of renewable generation on the system. And it's important to address that uncertainty with increasing flexibility on the system. And so there's the traditional options where thermal generation plant have provided that flexibility to system operators, but now we're moving to a stage where every home, every business could have a flexibility asset within it. And it's the control of those assets that is a key enabler for an increased renewable generation across the system. So that's it from me. I'll take any questions now.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Liam. So we've got a question in from James Elsmore, who's the organiser of the Virtual Energy Summit, Island Summit. He's asking how Orcadians can participate in the ReFLEX project.
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways. We are structuring a supply tariff for customers at the moment. So with our energy partner, our energy supply partner, we'll push out a particular bespoke tariff to them. That's based on having technology installed within their home, so a battery, if they have an EV already, an electric vehicle charger that we control, or if they don't have an EV already, that they actually lease the same, and we can control that EV asset. So essentially what the customer gets is a low cost tariff based on local renewable generation, but they enable the flexibility of the asset installed within their home to be used by ourselves and by the ReFLEX project partners.
Great, thank you. And another question from James, which I'll pose to Gareth. He was saying, you mentioned the idea of Orkney being this living laboratory, and he's wondering how Orcadians perceive that locally.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we've had quite a few discussions about that. The kind of negative connotation maybe being that we see ourselves as lab rats, whereas the positive connotation is that if we're at the front end of pioneering research, it's a positive place to be. On balance, we've looked at this and we feel that the concept of a living laboratory in Orkney is an incredibly positive one. There's actually examples of innovation going back not just decades or even hundreds of years, but thousands of years. And our colleagues that study archaeology here have been able to show that the people inhabiting Orkney 5,000 years ago were adopting and inventing technologies and solutions that they can then trace as they migrated down through the rest of the UK and into Europe. So that connotation of us being a laboratory is something that is perceived as being quite positive here in Orkney, and it gives us a platform to really chase after some of the more progressive and innovative funding mechanisms, and to encourage people to come and embrace Orkney as a place which can be used to trial and demonstrate pioneering new technology, which is something that we specialize in.
And a few other questions coming in through the Q&A function. So I'll put this one to Liam. This is in from Christine Milne. How are we going to persuade households to participate in ReFLEX, given that they will lose control of the flexible assets and won't have the control of when they can use energy?
Yeah, I suppose the key thing here is in terms of looking at the wider benefits for their homes. So their behaviour necessarily won't change. They'll still cook at the time they always cooked at. They will still charge their EV at the time they charged it, or they typically would have. And what we can do is, instead of feeding them from the grid at high cost times a day, we feed them from the battery. So the battery is charged at particular times. So overnight, for example, when they're generally using a lot less energy, and when the grid there's a lot less demand on the system, but also costs are reduced. And then we feed them from the battery during that day. So they don't see any net effect in terms of their behavior. Where they might see a slight changes in terms of their EV charging patterns, we may slightly adjust them, either reduce that charge or stop it at particular times, but always with the caveat that their end, the storage charge in their battery is what they set out to achieve. So if you wanted to fully charge your battery overnight in your electric vehicle, that will certainly be done. If you want to retain 40% of your energy capacity in your vehicle's battery, that'll be met as well. So the end customer sees no real change in terms of what they're doing within their premises, whether it be residential or commercial. it's how we work behind the scenes that is really really leveraging off the asset.
Lovely, thank you, Liam. Another question in here from Toby Sanderson, so I'm going to pose this one to Gareth. He's asking, are fixed links being considered for inter-island travel, or are they not feasible for Orkney?
Yeah, they have been considered and they are being considered. The nature of the ferry routes in Orkney is that they're quite long. We have ferry routes that last an hour and a half. So we're looking for shorter routes that could effectively be cost-effectively bridge-linked. To date, we haven't had any specific schemes that have got to a kind of detailed feasibility stage, but there have been some pre-feasibility studies done. I think, interestingly, our close cousins in Shetland are slightly differently configured because they have quite narrow sounds with tidal resources through them, and so there's a gap between Yell and Unst in Shetland, which is much more definitively being looked at for a fixed link. So yeah, it is something that we're interested in. At the moment, we haven't got any projects specifically working in Orkney.
So there are a few other questions here, but given that this leads us quite neatly into the next part of the presentation, I'll just pass you over to Gareth, who's going to give you a short introduction into the transport element of the ReFLEX project.
Yes, so when we looked at our energy system, we quickly found out that in terms of value and in terms of carbon footprint, transport was a major focus for us. And we need to get into the whole transport infrastructure, but we're starting off with vehicle transport first of all. So we've got two strategies for that. The first is to look at one of our islands and to look at how we can provide better transport infrastructure for charging and using electric vehicles in this island situation. So what we're looking to do is to link the power from the local wind turbine through flexibility assets into the vehicles themselves. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is looking to introduce charging stations at strategic places across the island, either at destinations or at ferry terminals where cars may come onto the island or where they're left when people go to the mainland of Orkney on the ferry. We're also going to be backing up some of these chargers with battery systems to exploit the opportunities that Liam's talked about in terms of controlling when that energy is taken off the grid to be given to the vehicle. As we mentioned, what we're looking to do is to pre-finance vehicles. So rather than looking for local residents to take on the burden of buying electric vehicles, we're going to be creating a fleet of local vehicles. So, and also kind of reintroducing public transport as a means of sharing collective interests with regards to transport. So as well as that island-based solution on the mainland of Orkney, and I should say that island that we talked about on Hoy, that has about 600, 700 people on it as an island community. When we come to the mainland of Orkney, we have 21,000 people in total across the islands, and probably about 15,000 of those on the mainland of Orkney. So here, what we're looking to do is to introduce, again, battery-backed chargers, large scale and smaller scale ones. And we're also looking to introduce 500 EVs. And rather than expecting people to buy them, these are going to be leased or available for lease on various terms. So if people want to lease a car for their own use, they'll be able to do that. But if they want to lease it through a car pooling mechanism, they'll also be able to do that. So going kind of linking into one of the questions that was asked before is how are we going to change people's behavior? What we're trying to do is to create a system that effectively matches people's behaviors at the moment, gets them into electric vehicles, but provides a positive incentive to lead them towards behaviors that might be overall more efficient. So it's not going to be a requirement to be in a carpool, but we are going to create a carpool and hopefully migrate more and more people into those as it becomes more successful. So what I'm going to do now, I think, is hand over to Richie and Adele, who are going to talk a bit more about hydrogen, and then I'll come back and talk about how that links into the heating system in Orkney as well.
Afternoon, everybody, or early morning, depending on where you are in the world. Yes, I'm just going to kind of walk through how EMEC managed to transition from being set up purely as a tide and wave energy test centre to being quite heavily involved in the hydrogen space. Now we've got over 10 staff that are directly working in hydrogen. We're running a whole load of different events, and we'll kind of talk you through the different projects and why this is important for the decarbonisation of Orkney. So we've touched on Orkney already, so we're up in the northeast of Scotland. Being in a remote islanded location, I'm sure many of you can attest that there's some issues with that. For ourselves, one of the biggest issues is we're the furthest branch of the UK national grid. That results in us paying some of the highest rates of electricity, which is a bit of a contrast considering, as Gareth has already mentioned, we've been producing over 100% of our annual electricity consumption since 2013. We also have a very high rate of fuel poverty. It's actually the highest, I've got written highest in Scotland, it's actually the highest in the UK. And around 60% of households in Orkney are actually in fuel poverty. And what that technically means is more than 10% of your household income is spent on fuel. And essentially it's a combination of the weather that we have up here, the sort of aging housing stock, and just those added expenses that we get from high import fuel costs. And yeah, politely said inclement weather, but it can be pretty brutal at times. There are quite a lot of upsides to our location though. There's an estimate that the waters around Orkney hold a potential renewable resource of up to 20 gigawatts, which, considering we're an island of just over 22,000 people, is quite a considerable resource for not only meeting our energy demands, but then exporting that back to other locations as well. As has already been mentioned, since 2013, we've generated over 100% annually of our electricity needs. And I think Gareth had mentioned since 2015, that's now down to a month-by-month basis. So over the course of a month, we actually have produced more renewables locally than has been consumed. One of the key things going forward is how can we capture that and sort of distribute it across day to day, which I think is a very important thing that the ReFLEX project is looking at. We've got a very high uptake of electric vehicles, and that will continue through the ReFLEX project as well. And as was mentioned, we've got over 740 micro wind turbines. There's a range of different solar options out there, whether it's solar PV or solar thermal heating systems. So it equates to about 1 in 10 households make their own power. So in recent years, the Orkney Sustainable Energy Strategy has been launched, and personally, I find one of the most crucial things to the success story of Orkney is just the community's engagement and the fact that everybody is able to sort of get on board with this. A lot of people locally really understand their energy needs, and I just don't really see that in other areas. So I guess that could be the same for other islanded nations that are tuning in as well. And we've got great organisations such as the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum, which gives the community a platform to sort of raise their concerns and discuss all the issues so we can find solutions together. Our main issue at the moment though is our export constraint. So even though we have this huge renewable resource surrounding us, we are limited in the amount of energy that we can get off Orkney or import if we were wanting to. Now, EMEC's story with hydrogen starts on our Caldale substation site, which is on the island of Edey, straight north of the mainland of Orkney. So EMEC has its tidal site set up at the Fall of Warness. There's 8 tidal test berths up there, and on the left-hand side of this photograph, that's our test substation. So the cables come into that, and then the power that's generated from tidal testing is distributed around Orkney. And on the right-hand side of the picture is our hydrogen production plant. And essentially, we're seeing so many larger scale tidal energy devices coming up to Orkney to test. The last 2 that we've had in at the Fall of Warness have a rated power of 2 megawatts. The fact that we have 8 berths available, if we're able to fill all of these, we wanted to be looking into sort of different uses for the energy. As has already been talked about, Orkney is excellent for producing renewable electricity, but how can we capture some of that energy and put it to use elsewhere in the areas of transport and heat? So this graph kind of indicates that when we're going through those large tidal cycles and we're producing large amounts of power, that could potentially be too much to be used or to export off the island of Ede. So having an electrolyser on site allows us to then produce green hydrogen, and we can store that and then use that for other sectors such as heat and transport. Another critical issue is the situation with curtailment in Orkney. This is looking at the same substation hydrogen production plant, but from the other side. And to the left-hand side of the screen is the Ede community-owned wind turbine. So this was purchased from community funds on the island of Ede. There's about 150 residents that live on the island. It's an Enercon 900 kilowatt turbine. When this was originally purchased, it was purchased through a new non-firm grid connection, which actually forms part of the active network management in Orkney. So what had happened was we reached a point of saturation on the local grid, and there was a memorandum put in place that we were not able to install any more wind generation on Orkney. There was a piece of work done that generated the UK's first active network management system. This is a software system that essentially allowed an extra 20 megawatts of generation to be added to Orkney's grid, but it effectively allows generators to be told when to turn off. If we're going to be producing too much electricity, we can kind of send them a signal and they're able to shut down. Unfortunately, those levels of curtailment are quite a bit higher than we've expected. And the turbine that we're showing there, they actually experienced curtailment of 50 to 60% of times that it could be generating. This is obviously a loss of funds to the local community because they're losing their feed-in tariffs that they should be getting paid. But overall, it's just a waste of renewable energy that we could be capturing. So as well as the tidal energy on our site, we're also looking at capturing wind, turning that into green hydrogen, and finding uses for that. That led us over to the Surf and Turf project and collaborating with Adele and everybody else over at the council.
Hi, good afternoon everybody. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm the Hydrogen Project Officer with the local authority here, Orkney Islands Council. And I have had the pleasure of working on Orkney's hydrogen projects, as Richie alluded to there. So really, some of the myths that we hear on a day-to-day basis are Orkney's generating lots of renewables, so therefore everybody has free or cheap electricity, and really that is not the case. We, Gareth mentioned earlier on, we pay a premium compared to the rest of the UK for our electricity, which is in part of the reason why we experience high levels of fuel poverty. So really the hydrogen projects were there to address kind of this wastage of renewable energy, this missed opportunity for the communities to generate income for themselves, and really to start addressing, you know, some of these energy storage issues that we've started seeing in general as a trend across the kind of renewable industry. So the first project that went live in Orkney regarding hydrogen was the Surf and Turf project here, and we've already discussed this island of Ede. So you can see it's off the mainland of Orkney. The population's around 100 people. It's where EMEC has their tidal test kind of substation there, and so it seemed like an ideal location to kind of lay down the first electrolyser. So that's a 0.5 megawatt electrolyser that's live on Ede, which uses that excess wind and tidal energy to generate hydrogen in those periods of curtailment where we can't export to the grid. So obviously being on an island, that created some further issues of how we move the hydrogen around, basically. So you can see in this image here, we have some specifically designed hydrogen storage trailers, so they can act as static storage when they are parked, and also mobile or you know, transport when they are on the move, basically. They're specifically designed to be able to travel on our kind of unique road infrastructure, which is not set up for heavy logistics, basically. But we have 5 of these in total, these trailers, and they carry 250 kilos of hydrogen each. So it's starting to build up these parts of the well, the kit that's actually been put in place and starting to tackle some of the problems that we've come across, being the kind of first project of its type. So we have the first electrolyser connected to community wind, to tidal. We've addressed that need to introduce storage, how we start to move it around, and in addition to that, we have a fuel cell that is back on the mainland of Orkney, which then can convert the hydrogen back into power, basically. So it's starting to create that loop of how we can use the hydrogen locally and how it's generated locally, and starting to kind of rustle out some of the issues that we may experience along the way. And that project was funded by the Scottish Government to roughly £3 million budget, so it's, you know, a significant investment for Orkney. And then building on the surf and turf project, we thought we could really take that a little bit further. So as well as the power aspect, using the hydrogen back for power, and I should say the power is used to power vessels here, ferries, when they are dockside. So that previously they would have plugged into the grid, or they would have used fossil fuels to do that. So now we can use the hydrogen to generate the power for that. So taking off a bit of the carbon from the system here. Great. So yeah, basically the big HIP project, which is an EU funded project, roughly €7.5 million for Orkney as well, expanded on those principles. So we added a few more trailers. We also added a 1 megawatt electrolyser on the second island of Shappensea. And again, that is a community wind turbine. Slightly lower rates of curtailment than ED, but still, you know, in the region of, well, it can be anywhere from 15 to 40% on Shappensea there. As well as using the hydrogen for power generation, in the big HIP project, we use the hydrogen for transport. So you can see we have some vans down here, hydrogen electric vans that we have purchased as a local authority and integrated into our fleet. So we have transport, and then we've also added 30 kilowatts of hydrogen catalytic boilers into a local primary school. So that kind of neatly starts to demonstrate the heat, the power, and the transport aspects that, you know, hydrogen can address. So it's kind of like Surf and Turf 2, the big HIP project, just really expanding. It's a bigger electrolyser, 1 megawatt, more hydrogen, adding, you know, kind of multiples of pieces of kit so that we don't experience single points of failure, adding infrastructure like a refueling station, vehicles, heat, and a few more lorries basically to transport the hydrogen around. What I feel that we've really discovered with undertaking these hydrogen projects is just how challenging the regulatory and legislative I don't know, what am I trying to say here? It's really difficult to transverse the regulations that are in place at the moment in terms of safety, yes, which should be, but also in terms of transporting hydrogen at sea. We've had to jump through plenty of loopholes to get the Marine Coast Guard Agency and other agencies like that on board with allowing us even to carry the hydrogen on board the vessels as cargo. So we've experienced a lot of those issues, but also connecting kit into the grid. So our fuel cell at the harbour is not linked into the local grid. So as was previously mentioned, we had a moratorium on any renewable generation connections, and because we could be exporting electricity back onto the grid, those assets are classed as generation as well as being demand. So really we have that issue, and we haven't really been able to test those as a grid balancing mechanism yet. But yeah, clearly there's you know, scope to do that. So really the regulations are kind of not working in the favour for using, you know, old term technologies in a modern sort of way. So I think those have been really important learning points of these projects so far. So we've started demonstrating that we can put kit in, that we can start to address local issues like curtailment, like lost income, lost revenues for communities. How do we transport the hydrogen around? What's the most suitable for us? What regulation, what barriers have popped up on the way? And then really testing this kit. So testing the van, testing the boilers, testing the trailers, to see, you know, what works and what doesn't work really. So that's been the kind of main learning points for the project so far, I would say. Just to get it out there, I think that partnerships have been instrumental in the success of all these projects. So I think it's safe to say that the renewable scene in Orkney, the continuing development of that renewable scene is very much bottom up. It's local companies, local communities, local people, individuals, farmers, realizing that renewable technologies are able to, you know, benefit their day-to-day life in some sort of manner, and it's really formalizing these groups and linking the groups together, and, you know, submitting these funding applications from this point of partnership that's really helped us move it forward and, you know, propagate the results in other regions as well. So in terms of Big Hit, you know, 12 partners from 6 European countries, and the projects that we're seeing moving forwards are even more partners than that, you know, double, triple the number of partners and many more regions in Europe. So, you know, each area brings its own kind of expertise, and that really has helped us build these very rounded projects, I feel. And there you can just get a kind of closer look at some of the kit that we have. So yeah, very interesting tourist attraction they've become, business tourism as well as day-to-day life as well. So people love to come and see the kit that's on the ground. So it's moving from this kind of theory-based project into, you know, putting actual kit down and learning in a harsh weather environment, I think it's safe to say there. So you can see some of our milestones. And from these projects, as a community in Orkney, so not just from the local authority, we thought there was a need to start looping some of those strands together and giving the hydrogen movement in Orkney a bit more direction moving forwards, and really how we can capitalise on what we've done so far as we see more communities kind of moving towards the hydrogen space when they're trying to balance their renewable integration, basically. So we came up with some principles there, which we think are kind of broadly representative of what we would like to achieve. The main thing really is green hydrogen production, and that's a really important one for us. But this just transition as well of how we move skills from traditional industries into the more modern kind of industries, like Gareth mentioned. There's hundreds of jobs in renewables, and there wasn't many engineering courses in renewables when they started taking on those jobs. So we're seeing that transition now of, you know, more education popping up specifically for renewables. But prior to that, you know, it's been this transition of traditional skills into the new kind of industries, really, and then continuing to promote this atmosphere, this lab atmosphere of innovative research and this collaborative approach to partnership when moving forwards with the project. So that was the idea behind our hydrogen strategy. Kind of a busy slide, but basically everything on the left in green is our kind of what we've achieved to date. So things like our first electrolyser, moving hydrogen from one island to another, you know, commissioning the hydrogen refueling station, integrating the van into the fleet. All the big projects are there, including the ReFLEX project. And then everything on the right there in red are the projects in the pipeline. That's really what I have awareness of. There's many more projects in the pipeline, but for us as a local authority, these are the ones that we've been involved in. And it's really just seen a scale up of what we're trying to achieve with every single project. Basically, it's adding a new element or more of something or a larger electrolyser. So really just being ambitious with the targets that we've been setting for the projects. Just a really kind of indicative overview. It's by no means what's going to happen into the future, but, you know, starting to set sort of a baseline of where we think we might be able to go with hydrogen in the future, kind of on a best educated guess from a lot of really high quality studies that have been done for our local region. So a lot of this comes from the ORF energy audit. We've done a ferries feasibility study on how we can decarbonise the local ferries. So the data here was just kind of building upon, you know, that base of knowledge that we've developed as a region to allow us to make much more informed decisions about where we would like to go moving forwards. Bear in mind that we very much see hydrogen, of course, integrating with what electricity can do. You know, if you can use electricity in the first instance, yes, you would do that. But there are going to be areas where we're going to need, you know, the storage basically, but where consumer expectation may not be met by electricity, or kind of any behavioural issues that can be kind of neatly transitioned into a carbon-free alternative. That's really where hydrogen would come in, as well as the heavy uses like your ferries, like your you know, road transport over multiple miles and things like that. So that's really where we see hydrogen going for Orkney in the future. And we haven't really started to address heat in anger either, and that's a massive government target. We've got, like we said, fuel poverty, so hopefully we'll be moving into that kind of heating aspect in the very near future as well. And then I'll pass you back over to Richie.
Yeah, so just to kind of reinforce those projects, for us in Orkney, it's all about energy resilience. It's the recognition that we want to capture potentially wasted renewable energy resources around us, but also the recognition that we're not going to be able to do absolutely everything with renewable electricity and electrons. So that's why we're really keen on looking at green hydrogen and where we can sort of spread that out across different projects. So currently we're working on stuff with ferries. As Adele mentioned, we've got the fuel cell, which is looking at supplying power to the ports. We're looking at hydrogen boilers, which was a part of the Big Hit project. I think also just linking into the heating aspect there. A lot of our projects are focused on transport, sort of going for the lower hanging fruit, as it were, but there's a big part of the ReFLEX project which is specifically looking at green hydrogen to be used in a combined heat and power unit for one of the big energy users on Orkney. We also have an aviation project underway at the moment that hopes to have a green hydrogen powered aircraft testing in Orkney by the end of 2020. And a big one for us that we're involved in is looking at the distillery sector as well. There's a lot of push. We sort of mentioned ecotourism, but the more and more people are aware of their energy use and their consumption needs, you can see this kind of light bulb moment for a lot of people, that they want to know where their energy comes from, that their products are coming from sustainable sources. So in terms of distilleries, it's quite difficult to have that high intense industrial heat facility from renewable electricity. So hydrogen is looking at like a very attractive prospect for decarbonising that. And we're leading into future projects more in terms of energy storage, grid balancing, industry and further transport, and hopefully ReFLEX will be feeding into quite a bit of that as well. Some of the obstacles and sort of the key learning, Adele's touched on a few of these, but I'll just quickly run through them. I think in terms of maritime legislation and sort of regulatory barriers that are in the way, these are all cutting edge projects, first of their kind. They were never all going to go very without a hitch. And I think some of the biggest learning that we've had is about the regulation that's in place. So we've been working closely with the Marine Coast Guard Agency in terms of moving hydrogen and using hydrogen as a fuel in ferries. We do have that, the fact that we are generating hydrogen in a remote location. That makes hydrogen logistics very complicated. As Adele mentioned, we have bespoke trailers for moving our hydrogen around. This is all great learning that we can pass on to other people. And yeah, our generation at the moment is remote, but we're looking at sort of moving that into a more centralised location. There is a lot of subsidy support out there. For the UK, the Department of Transport last year allowed to include renewable hydrogen in the renewable transport fuel obligation. So you can actually get subsidy credits if you're using green hydrogen in your vehicles, like the council are doing with the Kangoo Easy vans. We're lobbying for this to be extended so it can include aviation transport and ferries as well, and we hope that to happen in 2021. Overall, main obstacle is just upfront cost. These are all cutting edge technologies. Price is coming down, but we're still quite far away from making it a commercially viable offering. And I think there's so much critical learning that needs to happen. And as Adele mentioned, so much of that coming from collaboration has been fantastic, because we can't just carry on with business as usual. Professor Sir David King, who was a chief scientist for the government before starting the Cambridge University Centre for Climate Repair, he quoted a few months ago, what we do over the next 10 years will determine the future for the next 10,000. So I think that's quite a prominent note to end our talk on, and I'm hoping that green hydrogen and our work up in Orkney is going to be able to feed into that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richie and Adele. So just before we move on to Gareth final presentation, there are quite a few questions coming in. Now, I think some of these questions have already been answered in the presentation, so I'm going to focus on the ones that I don't feel have been quite answered yet, but we will try and get an answer to everyone maybe following the session today. So Richie, I was going to give this first couple of questions to you, in from Jerry Butler. He's first of all asking about the safety concerns around hydrogen. You could, in a nutshell, cover some of that.
So we had, in terms of safety is paramount to everything that we're doing here. We've been working very closely on different projects with doing a lot of safety review and safety case stuff. For the marine stuff that I've been heavily involved in, we've been working with Lloyd's Register. Not only have they got somebody on their staff that's got 30 years experience working in hydrogen, but they're also, they underwrite the maritime sector, so they also know a lot about that industry as well. A note on hydrogen from a public perspective in terms of safety. Last week we were running a workshop down in the Aberdeen hydrogen event. One of the presentations was with BOC and Aberdeen Council, and they've been running a fleet of 10 hydrogen buses the last couple of years. They've achieved over 1.6 million miles and had over 1 million passengers on board. Not one person that was asked ever gave feedback that they had any safety concern. These buses were slotted in with all the regular routes, so you could, if you didn't feel like it, just wait for the next bus to come along. And I thought that was quite a prominent thing to show that, yeah, there is confidence in the public there. But.
And just to add to Richie's point there, in terms of the kind of heating systems and put in, we have undertaken an independent safety review of the heating kit that's going in as part of the big HIP project. That hydrogen is, you know, covered by HSE regulations. There's already standards for carriage of hydrogen, etc. So it's not that it's completely unregulated. It's where you're kind of integrating systems and using novel use, but you know, there's already standards there for refueling stations, etc. And just to echo Richie's point, when we've been out in the community, you know, it rarely comes up as a topic that people are concerned about the safety.
So another question here on the hydrogen, looking at how it's integrated into boats. Can a conventional diesel boat engine be used with hydrogen, or do you need a special retrofit?
So the system that we're running on the Hydine project is it is a retrofit, but you don't actually have to change too much with the engine itself. Our partners Ulemco are based out of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. They've been installing this system in diesel injection automotive engines for quite some time. This is going to be the first time it's been done in the marine sector. It essentially introduces hydrogen at the point of air intake to a diesel internal combustion engine. And the engines themselves are very good at self-regulating the fuel that's consumed. So we're not able to completely stop all the diesel use in the system that we're installing, but we're about to displace about 50% of it. So it's estimated that for every kilogram of hydrogen that we can use, we'll displace about 3 litres of marine diesel, which is great. And just on that, Ulemco have now taken a full Volvo tractor unit, like a lorry trailer, and they've converted that to use completely 100% hydrogen gas as an internal combustion. So it does give us an option. Instead of high-tech fuel cells, combustion is an option now.
And another question around hydrogen here, this has come from a few different people. So is hydrogen the best storage technology for excess renewable energy in Orkney? And has pumped hydro storage or other battery technologies been considered?
Yeah, I think all of those have been considered. I think on cost, basically hydrogen, you can basically store it in quite a you know, in a prefabricated storage vessel, like a container, like what we're doing now. Well, basically a tube inside a trailer or static storage. Basically, there's not much opportunity for pumped hydro because it's very flat. So it's been looked into whether that could happen with some, you know, pre-existing kind of oil, disused oil kind of technology that's left behind. But really, you know, it's too flat for pumped storage. So hydrogen seems like a good fit for us. We haven't really broached the lithium question here as well. So, you know, reducing the need for finite resources will probably be more critical as we move forward with renewables in the future as well. So obviously we can mitigate a lot of that with hydrogen, you know, but we still will need battery storage also.
Yeah, definitely. And just to touch on that, hydrogen's quite good in the sense that it gives you lots of long-term storage, that you can look at it as a seasonal to seasonal storage if you can keep it somewhere for long enough. And it's also just applicable across all the different sectors. We can use it to turn back into electricity, but when we actually look at that, the price factor of electricity and the fact we make so much renewable energy, that's not the key place we should be using hydrogen. We should be using it in the transport and heating sector. So it's applicable across the board, which I think is great.
Another question in here around hydrogen from Jenny Kermode from Paisley. She's wondering if there's any issues with transporting hydrogen in winter, and does it mean the system can only work properly during the warmer months?
Not in terms of the technical aspect of using hydrogen or using the fuel cells. The fuel cells themselves, for example, are kept warm, and once running, they produce their own heat and stay warm. With the injection engine, it starts off in its normal diesel cycle, and the hydrogen's then introduced. One of the issues will be the fact we have to rely on ferry transport to move our hydrogen around, and we have some quite severe winter months up in Orkney. So in terms of inclement weather, that could have an effect, but not from a technological aspect.
Yeah, and well, it depends what you're classing as winter as well. You know, in Orkney, we very rarely go below 0. So, you know, in regions where you're minus tens of C, I'm not sure what the answer is. But like Richie said, you know, there's heating systems in place to keep the system at the optimal temperature for operation.
Great. I'm going to bring Liam back into the conversation because he's sort of linking into this remotely, and there's a few questions focused on Solo Energy's presentation previously. So from Jerry Butler, he was asking about the shareholders of both the utility and of Solo. I suppose if you could maybe give a bit of an indication around the relationship there.
You mean the backers? Well, I suppose that's what it does mean. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Smart Metering Solutions Group. We've no direct link with the supplier or any, there's no equity shared between businesses. What we provide to energy suppliers is a servicing facility. So we provide energy as a service to those suppliers. So they pay for that service like they would to any service provider. But beyond that contractual relationship for a service provision, there's nothing else there from a commercial perspective.
Lovely, thank you. And I'll take just one more question, then we'll pass it on to Gareth. Question in here from Becky May. Going back to kind of storage solutions, she's interested to find out if how advanced domestic thermal storage is at the moment, and at what point will privately owned storage be a real possibility. And she's asking because she's got a domestic wind turbine and is still paying for electricity from the grid at times when there's not much wind.
Liam, do you want to answer on the battery side?
Sorry, I missed that one. There was a bit of background noise here. Can you repeat?
It's a lady with a micro wind turbine wondering when a battery solution might be available commercially for her to apply to her house.
Well, there's battery solutions commercially available right now already. Some are modular, so you can size them based on whatever capacity wind turbine you have. I'm assuming it's a micro wind generator, 6 kilowatt or 10 kilowatt, but there's various different solutions on the market already. Different chemistries. There's lithium ion, lithium iron phosphate. There's plenty of solutions out there, yeah, that have been proven over the last number of years as well. So they're not in their infancy in terms of technology.
Lovely, thank you. So there are still some questions here. We'll do our best to get through them, but I'm going to pass over to Gareth here for the final presentation.
Okay, so we've kind of started with electricity under ReFLEX and then looked at transport, and just wanted to finish off with a little bit more on heat. So we've mentioned about the fuel poverty in Orkney, and you can see here that despite the price of oil going down significantly, and about 25% of our households are on oil, the majority of them are on electric, and those are the people that are largely in this fuel poverty trap. We have people that can be on as much as 40%, over 40% of their income getting spent on heating fuels. So that's very extreme fuel poverty. So some of these air-to-air heat pumps you can see there, air-to-water heat pumps as well, are already getting widely adopted. Interestingly, on the heat pump side, our most productive heat pump in Orkney is a water-to-water heat pump, which supports our local library in Stromness, and that has it's up to a 7-to-1 energy in to energy out ratio. So that's really amazing for a heat pump. So that's the background against which we're trying to address these innovative heating solutions. So we're looking to see whether heat pump rollout, whether smart storage heaters backed by batteries can be a part of that. I think a lady was asking what other storage solutions there might be in a house, like extra large water tanks is another route that you can go down, so that you might get 2 or 3 baths or showers out of the tank rather than one. I mean, in the old days, our wood stores and our coal bunkers were effectively batteries because we stored, you know, months worth of fuel in those situations. So our houses have been used for storage over a long time period. So what we're also looking to do, as well as looking at household energy, we're looking at public building energy, and this is a system that we're going to be putting into a local leisure centre. So basically, on the back of the hydrogen production that you saw from Richard and Adele, we're going to be getting gaseous hydrogen, and that's going to be brought to a site in Kirkwall, where it's going to be converted to heat and power, either through a fuel cell or a hydrogen engine. Again, Richard was alluding to the fact that that technology is emerging now, and that heat and power be used to maintain the swimming pool and other leisure facilities going forward. So what you've seen here is this dark blue line. We've got electricity, transport, and heat, and those are at the core of our energy system within Orkney. I think we've also shown you how batteries and hydrogen can offer buffer storage and balancing energy supplies. And that's really important because we don't want the people in Orkney or our energy systems to suddenly become degenerated in some ways as we decarbonise them going forward. We're also trying to link at the top there with local energy generation, and that's going to be a mix of wind and marine and thermal energy from the heat pumps, as well as solar energy. And by taking that energy mix, we get energy production which is out of phase across the different technologies, and that helps us deliver a more universal overall energy system. When we come down below the dark blue lines, you can see there's 3 areas of use. So we've got direct local use in our houses, in our buildings, in our cars. We've also got then commoditization of energy into products for either use locally or exporting. And then we've got the third option, which is to export the energy that we produce in Orkney and use it elsewhere. And if you remember back, as Richie stated, there's been up to 20 gigawatts of raw resource identified around Orkney. So that's thousands of times more energy than we need on the islands themselves. And so that concept of export may be incredibly important to us. What we also need is to have efficient use of energy. You know, any energy resource, whether it comes from renewables or fossil fuels, it needs equipment, it needs technologies to support it. And if we can use less energy, effectively that's the easiest way of decarbonising. And we also want to look at the value and the quality of the service provided. So in our local energy system, I think as a community, we're looking to improve on the services that we've had to date. And as we create a local energy company, that company needs to look after all of our energy needs going forward in the future. So basically the question then for ReFLEX is, okay, these are great technical solutions, but how are we going to manage and organize all of these things? And so what we've identified is that we need a 2-tier company setup basically to do that. So we want to trade locally and trade globally in financed energy services. So what we envisage is having what we call ReFLEX Global, which is an umbrella commercial vehicle, and the solutions and the ideas that are coming out of the ReFLEX project will feed into that ReFLEX global entity. And then those findings will be able to share not only with Orkney, which will be our first local trading company, but also with other geographies across the UK and across the world. And what we're looking to do is, by having a robust and comprehensive business case for this new kind of energy system, to be able to attract major investment into the ReFLEX global umbrella, so that there's funding available to cascade down to the local energy companies. And at a local level, we're looking to reach out to local authorities, local governments, local people, local businesses, to see if they would like to co-invest at that lower level in the local energy companies, so that we end up with a twin track approach of embracing global finance might with local finance capacity as well. And this is maybe a good time, perhaps, and if James could perhaps launch another poll to just see whether people are interested in actually getting involved with ReFLEX. We want, as a project team, to get other communities aware of what ReFLEX can give them and see how that can happen in the future. So if you're interested in that, please get in touch and we can speak to you later on. So one of the other things that we've realized is that the ReFLEX project is just a part of what we have to achieve over the next time period. If you think back to the very start, where I suggested that we need in Orkney to decarbonise our energy system by 2030. So we've got 10 years to effectively do that. So at the bottom here, you can see that ReFLEX Core is the project that we're working on at the moment, and that actually does about 10% of the job. So we need to prove to ourselves that we've got the tools that can then take us into this ReFLEX Plus period, where we're going to expand beyond the program that we've got at the moment to decarbonise the whole energy system. At the moment, the ReFLEX Core project is worth about £28 million. We believe that we're going to need over £200 million to decarbonise Orkney as a whole over the next 10 years. So that's the scale of the endeavour. And that's why it's this mixture of major private finance as well as local finance that's going to be needed to do that. So when we move to other locations, what we want to do is to take that model elsewhere. So we would start off with a pilot project in another region and then expand into a decarbonisation process that's appropriate for those areas. Now, in Orkney, we're not going to wrap up what we've learned on ReFLEX into a box and put a bow on it and send it out to all of these other places. What we're going to try and do is learn some of the lessons that we've got from Orkney and apply it in an appropriate way to local conditions in these replication locations, and also work with local partners to understand the tools and the technologies and the approaches that work in each of these locations. So it can be a collaborative approach to rolling out ReFLEX in these various locations. And the reality is that over the next 10 or 20 years, that's going to require billions of pounds of investment. And so we're in Orkney now actively creating fund management structures that can attract investment to support this overall initiative. So how are we going to do that? So what we have to do is be very aware of the pressures that there are in the world and the values that are going to underpin such a transformational approach to energy supply. And we're really then trying to blend two things. We're trying to blend what we call the Orkney way. We're looking at the way in which things have happened in Orkney because they've been successful. We've managed to achieve a level of decarbonisation that hasn't been possible in other places. And what we want to do is match those with more universal ways of doing things which are enshrined within the Sustainable Development Goals, and use that to deliver appropriate solutions wherever we go in the world. So this is the kind of the compass of values and standards that we will then take with ReFLEX into these different communities. So if we do that, hopefully we'll end up with an energy system that will work for everybody, including the infrastructure. And if we go again, you'll see here that Margaret Mead, as she said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gareth. So we're coming up to the end of time, but 4 minutes left. So there are a couple of questions that I'll cover here. For any of the questions that we've not gotten through, we will post up answers on Facebook in the afternoon today. So Liam, I was going to pose this question about blockchain technology to you, of whether you'd considered integrating blockchain with smart meters so that households can share the cost and make more transparent planning for resource allocation. Are you happy to give a quick answer on that, please?
Yeah, we are actually doing some work in the blockchain space. There is definitely some merit in looking at these solutions in terms of reducing costs for consumers. But the technology is robust. I would say the applications of blockchain in the energy space are reasonably early stage. They're fairly in their infancy. But there's a number of different applications that we would see merit in looking at, and we do have a project ongoing in that regard.
Lovely, thank you. And the last question, and you've got 2 minutes to answer this, Gareth, before we get cut off, comes from Becky May. So she's interested to hear that Orkney hopes to be completely carbon neutral by 2030, but just interested to know exactly how we're going to achieve that.
Becky, if we knew all of those answers, we would be very happy people and we would sleep easier at night. I think one of the things that we found in Orkney is that we need to set a target in order to achieve it. And as a community across the private, public sector, the voluntary sector, every part of our community has basically got behind particular targets, which we've then been able to achieve. So having followed that pathway before, we felt this was the right way to go again. I mean, the 2030 target, and it may indeed be a little bit earlier than that, is extremely challenging because of the scale of transition that's needed. But I think if we all think to the climate emergency and some of the messages that are coming out about the pace at which change is going to happen and the pace at which change needs to happen, we haven't really got a choice. If given Orkney's background in sustainable energy systems, we can't be first. And if we can't get to a significant or decarbonisation by 2030, you know, the question arises, well, who else is going to do it? So we understand that imperative. We're now using it to canvas for support to help us achieve that. We're also looking locally to the resources that we spend to make sure that that's spent in the right way. So those are some of the tools that we're using to do that.
Thank you. So we're going to have to bring this session to a close now. So just want to extend my thanks again to Gareth, Liam, Richie and Adele for some really interesting, insightful presentations there. Apologies that we didn't get through all the questions, but as I said, we will post up answers to your questions on the Facebook Live post on the Island Innovation Facebook page. We're really keen to hear from you if you want more information or have further questions about any of the projects that you've heard in the presentations today. Please do email us. You'll find our contact details on either the EMEC, Aquaterra, Solo or Orkney Islands Council website. We'll put that up on the Facebook page as well. Or ask if there's particular questions about ReFLEX, if you could email info@reflexorkney.co.uk. Be great. So thank you very much for joining us for the Orkney Energy Revolution session, and I hope you have a brilliant day or evening wherever you are.
Thanks everybody.